Hi, we want to talk about the Deuteronomistic history in this presentation. What's the Deuteronomistic history? Well, we've talked about how the Bible is a library of libraries. So we shouldn't think of this as just the Bible as one book, but a collection of collections. And so the Deuteronomistic history is one of these collections. If you remember, we talked about the documentary hypothesis, and that we have the combination of these three sources, J, E, and P, that come together to form the first four books of the Pentateuch. The fourth letter, D, stands for Deuteronomy, but that only is referring to the book of Deuteronomy. We don't have the Deuteronomistic historian's editorial hand present in the first four books of the Pentateuch. It's only the last book. Most scholars would say that the Deuteronomistic historian and this collection of books that we're going to look at was written or put into their final form during the Babylonian exile. So again, this pivotal time of the exile as sort of the moment at which the canon takes on its authoritative structure, and in response to this great tragedy of the exile. How do we make sense of this event where we not only lost militarily to the Babylonians, but were sent from our homeland, the land we had been promised as an eternal inheritance, and now sent over into a foreign land, and then to top it all off, the destruction of the temple, God's holy house. How could they be able to conquer and defeat our God? What's the reason for that? And we talked about this in a previous class and videotapes. Really what the issue here is one of theodicy. If God's all powerful, God's all good, and terrible things happen in the world, how do we make that sense of that? How do we make sense of this terrible thing called the exile if we believe God's all powerful, so therefore they shouldn't have been able to conquer his house? If he's all good, that he cares for us and made his promises to us that he would give us this land forever, and now we're not in it. How do we make sense of it? Well, the Deuteronomistic historian's solution is that the exile is a punishment or a correction for our infidelity to God's ways. And that, in some sense, I'd say Deuteronomy sees God in the more emotional terms I have here. He's less transcendent, more human. He's more like a parent, I would say, in the Deuteronomistic historian's framework. And so therefore, like a parent, yes, you're still powerful, but you allow certain things to happen to your children, natural consequences we call that, in order to bring them back to the proper way. Now, that I have here in my statement on the bottom, allows space for God's capriciousness. That's sort of the issue that has to be wrestled with. If you don't have a God who is willing to get into the messiness of things, stays removed, stays sort of this iceberg sort of God, well, okay, you avoid the charge of him being capricious, being willing to allow things to happen that may seem as if he's going against his promises. But, I think in the Deuteronomistic historian's perspective, that's not the idea. He's not capricious. That just because he's emotionally connected to us like a parent who desires the best for us and allows those natural consequences to happen, that's not capricious. It's actually intentional. But that could be the charge, I guess is what I'm trying to say, of this sort of solution. But I think from the Deuteronomistic historian's perspective, God is still faithful in terms of his ongoing care for his people, even as he allows for this self-correction, if you will, through history. All right, so what is the Deuteronomistic history? Well, we're really talking about the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. we've talked about how the Bible gets sort of divided up in different ways. Kind of the classic division is that you look on the right, you have the Torah and the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And then you have either, if we were to use the terminology, in the tripartite division of the Bible into Torah, prophets, and writings, then we would talk about Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings as the former prophets. If you use the quad, what would that be? The quad division, the fourfold division of the Old Testament into Pentateuch, historical books, prophets, and wisdom literature, then we call these books of Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings as part of the historical books, along with some other ones. So, even within the tradition, titles have been used differently to try to describe the nature of these texts. What we find in modern scholarship, a very influential scholar called Von Rad, he first noticed that there are some connections between Deuteronomy and Joshua. So he wanted to talk about not the Pentateuch, which is obviously mean penta, 5, but the Hexateuch, that is, hex is, hecta is 6. So he wanted to talk about, no, this group of books should be put together, these 6 books. There's a unity between them. Well, then a very influential scholar, Martin Note, who we're going to talk about more about. Martin Note, a German scholar, stated that, wait a minute, actually, yes, Von Rad noticed something interesting in terms of a linkage between Deuteronomy and Joshua, but that what he didn't pay attention to was the linkage between Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, that the division should actually be started with Deuteronomy and grouping these books together. So that's really what we have here is in this theory, which is a dominant theory within biblical scholarship, is that the Deuteronomistic historian, or the Deuteronomistic history, sometimes called Deuteronomic, some scholars make a distinction between Deuteronomic and Deuteronomistic. I won't go into that, but usually they're used interchangeably. He would say that this is the library shelf, if you will. These really, because 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings once were probably one book. So anyway, even though we divide them up, so you're talking about 6 books. I'm sorry, 5 books. Or if you want to count them with their 1 and 2s, then we're talking about 7 books. All right. So who is Martin Note, then? What's this Deuteronomistic history theory that he developed? Well, he said that there was a redactor, an editor, who put together these various materials from the past to address the needs of the people in the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. And basically, as I sort of already alluded to, it's the collection of these 5 or 7, depends on how you want to count them, books. And while these were diverse materials, hero tales, tribal traditions, royal records, the editor combined them into one sort of theological lens, through one theological or ideological lens that accounts for the exile in terms of looking at Israel's and Judah's history. So the idea is that the editor kind of ties together these divergent materials to form this literary unit. So these would have been written in different contexts, different times, but the Deuteronomistic historian puts them together and gives them an overlay of a theological interpretation that makes sense of how the exile happened. As we've already kind of articulated, what he has to deal with is how is it possible that God seems to have broken his everlasting promise that he provided in Genesis to give the land and to be ruled by the house of David. So land and temple. Is God untrustworthy and unworthy of honor and worship? And also this other question about God's power. Should we switch to the Babylonian gods since, in fact, Yahweh was defeated, as is evident from the fact that his temple is destroyed? Is that what that means? And of course, Deuteronomistic historians are going to give a different interpretation. Instead, it says, no, the reason why we lost the land, the reason why the temple was destroyed, is because of our sin. We rejected Yahweh, who's the Lord of history, for the God of the Canaanites, Baal and Asherah, which we had a little exposure to their theology when we looked at Genesis 2 and 3. If you remember that story about Baal and Asherah, also sometimes called Anet, and their creation myth. So clearly, if you read the Deuteronomistic history, you see the people rather regularly turning towards Baal versus Yahweh. So the punishment is because we've left God, not that God left us. And so therefore it's our fault that this exile has happened. But there's a promise of forgiveness and redemption. So the Deuteronomistic historian is not being totally pessimistic, because inlaid within his message is the belief that if we repent, if we reform, God will bring us back to the land, will restore us in his favor. And that would be sustaining in trying times. We have hope. Here I provide you Weinfeld's delineation of the 10 major themes of the Deuteronomistic historian, this history. So what are some common themes across these 5 or 7 books, however you count them? So the themes are struggle against idolatry, the centralization of cult at Jerusalem, this theme of election, exodus, conquest, themes of this sort of the sense of God's care through the actions of history, a real focus upon monotheistic faith, an emphasis upon observance of the law, the inheritance of the people of the land. The land is the chosen people's inheritance. This framework of reward and retribution, or blessings and curses, is a kind of a framework to understand our responsibilities and God's responses. And then the focus on prophecy and how prophecies are fulfilled. And of course, this is helpful in times of stress, because there's a sense that God will remain faithful to his word. Then the focus upon David and his dynasty, and then this theme of distrust of anything that's foreign, that's not Jewish, because that takes you down away from monotheistic faith and into idolatry. All right. This is what I call here is little inside DTRH baseball. The Deuteronomistic historian. You don't really know this, but need to. But just to get you an idea of how notes theory is received, you do have this sort of division between those who see the first edition written during the reign of King Hosea prior to the exile to support his reforms, and then the second editions written during the Babylonian exile, when those reforms didn't protect the people, when actually they were led into exile. Smid's perspective is that which is again a little different than Noth, because Noth sees the whole Deuteronomistic historian's work being done during the exile. Smed goes the other way. He says it starts, yes, like Noth says, in the exile, but that it was in the post-exilic context that the Deuteronomistic historian was finished, and that you had further elaborations during that period. I see some problems with Smed's approach, but that said, I think that both of them maintain the importance of the exile as the formative moment for the Deuteronomistic historian. All right, so let's go through some of the individual books of the Deuteronomistic historian. First, we have the book of Deuteronomy itself. Deuteronomy means second law. Deutero, second, nomos, law, second or repeated laws. And you do see basically a retelling of the story of the the Exodus and the number of traditions in a briefer form presented within the book of Deuteronomy. It's sort of a epitome of what we've read about the Exodus and wanderings in the desert. The theme of the book is that God makes a treaty with Israel, in which obedience brings blessing and disobedience brings chaos. You'll see down here, so there's a real theme of blessings and curses. See down here, I provide you these depictions of the sacred way in Lakota tradition. I think this gives you a good idea that there are two ways in Lakota tradition, and you know the black way and the red way. And you want to stay on the red road. You don't want to go on the black road. So kind of this dualistic framework that there's two paths you can take in life, and you need to stay on the red road. If you go on the black road, that's leads you to sin, we call that, to a life that's not fulfilling. All right. Well, if you stay on the red road, you receive blessing. It's good. It's a good life. If you want, we're not going to go through these, but if you wanted to pause here, you could get a sense of the Deuteronomy's theology by reading these selected passages. But I'm going to move you along into the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua is about how Yahweh leads Israel to conquer the land of Canaan, the promised land, at the end of the exile and wandering in the desert stories. I'm sorry, not exile. I keep saying exile. I mean Exodus, after the Exodus and the wanderings in the desert stories, as they come into the promised land. And it's told in a way that God conquers, leads them to victory, but whenever there's any unfaithfulness by the part of Israel, that's the only way that God's will can be thwarted. And so, as I say here, it's Yahweh's cause and Yahweh's fight and Yahweh's victory. That seems to be the point of the book of Joshua. And Yahweh achieves this in sort of this three-stage victory. First, they come into the Central Highlands. We looked at the topography in the other video. And then they go to the north and take over Hazor. And then, first they go to the south, do Beersheba, then go to the north in the third phase. So there's sort of this deliberate, unstoppable blitzkrieg, if you will, through the Holy Land, as long as the people stay faithful to Yahweh. Kind of the book of Joshua in a nutshell is told through the siege of Jericho, the first city they conquer, coming across the Jordan River. And if you read that story, you'll see they're marching around the city 7 times with the ark in front, and it's almost like a procession. Today we might call that a Eucharistic procession or something of that nature. It's a very ritualized sort of action, and then the walls come down. The power of God brings the walls down, not the invading armies. And we have this requirement that all the people and all the animals of Canaan are to be destroyed. We might want to unpack that, because we've talked about this a little bit with regard to Exodus. Clearly what's being depicted here is the power of God, not trying to give biblical warrant to genocide. But what's interesting in that is, while in Joshua we get a sense that all the people are killed, and Judges they're living amongst them. So there's a little contradiction between Joshua and Judges in terms of the nature of the taking of the promised land. A good example of how it's only the people's unfaithfulness that can lead to the thwarting the will of God is that when Jericho is defeated, the command by God is that all the possessions will be offered to him, since he's the victor. He gets all the spoils. But one soldier keeps some of the booty for himself. And when they go into Ai and try to defeat Ai, they're unsuccessful. And the reason is because that guy kept some of the stuff. And so once he's punished, then victory is had. All right. And so why would you tell this version of the conquest of the land, meaning the Holy Land? Because it has a sense that it's going to be through God's action, not ours, that we're going to be able to come back to the promised land. And so really what we have to do here in the hotbed of the exile is purify ourselves and get back to being faithful, follow his ways, and then we'll receive those blessings. And that God will lead us from Babylon back to Canaan. He'll do it again. That is the point of telling the story in this manner. Now, there's other traditions out there that the Deuteronomistic historian had to deal with, traditions that we find in the book of Judges. This is a different, what happens after Joshua takes over the land, and you get a very sort of different portrayal of the situation at this point than what we had in Joshua. Here, the Canaanites are living among them, so where'd that Haran thing go? And they seem to possess it. The tribes are this loose confederation, and every once in a while God would raise up what's called a judge, which really just doesn't mean a legal judge like we think of a judge, but rather a military leader, a deliverer, one who's going to set things right. So different leaders are led up. And if you read the book of Judges, you'll see that the righteousness of those leaders sort of slips down over time. They become less and less their character is less edifying over time. What we see in Joshua then is this pattern that the people, basically what happens is the people turn away from God. God raises up an enemy to punish the people, some sort of oppression. Then the people cry out for help. They cry to God. They turn back to Him. And then God raises up a deliverer. This pattern repeats itself over and over and over again. And if you remember, this is the Baal cycle in terms of the battle between Baal and Mot. You know, they have a battle. They're in competition. Mot kills Baal. Anet takes on Mot and defeats him, and then Baal comes back to life. And then the cycle, because that's the cycle of nature, it repeats itself over and over again. So, you know, with similar kind of patterns being used here in Judges, maybe even being co-opted from the surrounding religious expressions, to say something about the nature of our experience. And this sort of cyclical telling of history, you know, one of the questions is, well, how does that give you hope? Because the hope is that, look, we know what happened. We turned away from God. We're now feeling oppression. What we have to do is turn back to God. If He does that, He'll develop a leader who will lead us back to the land. So we know this cycle is not just a one-time thing; it's a continuous thing. And so, you know, it's kind of like if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. So let's learn from this history. Big focus on I say the Deuteronomistic history as a whole, but certainly in Judges is the focus on the land. The land is seen as gift. It's seen as also a summons, though. We have to respond to that gift in how we live our lives. And it's also a seduction. We can get, I think the point is that people can kind of get overly dependent upon believing the land will protect them rather than seeing it as a gift that needs to be appreciated. It's seen as property that's possessed, and it's God's land, so that's a mistake. We're going to spend a lot of time in class dealing with 1 and 2 Samuel. So we're only going to focus on, particularly on the David stories. So we're going to talk about these books more in relationship to the non-Davidic portions. So first off, it starts off with the last judge, Samuel, being raised up. And he's not able to really deal with the military conflicts of the Philistines. So they decide to move to a monarchy, and they raise up a king, first Saul, and then later David, and then later Solomon and other kings. 2 Samuel continues the story of David's rise. And what we see within this text is some repetitions, contradictory accounts, telescope stories. But this is religious history, not modern history. As we look at the Deuteronomistic historians' perspective on kingship, it's interesting. We have sort of two strands, both being at odds with each other a bit. One is sort of some passages that seem to bemoan the fact that they have a king, and others that seem to be positive about a king. We're going to look about this look at this in class, unpack this dynamic a little bit more. But I give you here passages from 1 Samuel that, if you're so inclined, you can certainly take a look at, preview prior to class. But we'll have to investigate this a little bit more about why would that be? Why within this text would we have both positive and negative portrayals of the king? All right. One interesting aspect of this portrayal of the kingship is that the first king, the story of Saul, seems to be formulated or structured in a way of a tragedy. While if you know anything about Greek and tragedy and comedy, which again we'll talk more about in class, but the plot trajectory of Saul is that it starts off very positively until the point where Saul violates the boundaries of his office and usurps Samuel's role, where he offers sacrifice, doesn't wait for Samuel, he gets impatient at one moment. There in 1 Samuel 13. For Samuel to show up to offer the sacrifice, Saul does it instead, and then he seems to overcorrect, that is Saul, by demanding abstinence by his military, by his army, in terms of abstaining from eating and water, and they're in 1 Samuel 14, which results in defeat. And then the trajectory of the plot from that point forward, Saul starts to become, it seemed, even portrayed seemingly as sort of dealing with some mental illness, depressive, seemingly, at least that's how we might today express his personality at that point and his issues, and also of abusing his power, and to the point where Saul ultimately is sort of this tragic figure. So that's very interesting in terms of the first king of Israel is portrayed in this sort of negative light. We will look at David in some detail, the story of David. But to jump over David, we can, and also Solomon, we'll move to 1 and 2 Kings. Now, in 1 Kings, we do hear the story of Solomon, but when Solomon dies, that's when the kingdom divides in half. So you have the northern and southern kingdom. So again, I've made this, noticed this already, that the United Kingdom is a very brief period of time, even within the biblical record of, even though that's the ideal, is this united kingdom between north and south. Even within the biblical telling of the story, it's a very brief moment of unity, less than 100 years. So the dominant structure has been either as tribes, independent tribes that sometimes collaborate together, or 2 nation states that have a common ethnic and religious identity to some degree, but are politically distinct. And in some ways, the northern kingdom was the more powerful one that dominated the southern kingdom of Judah, even though Jerusalem's in the south. In 1 and 2 Kings, the succeeding kings after the division of the kingdom, the kings of Israel are universally portrayed negatively. They're always unfaithful to Yahweh. And while Judah's kings can fluctuate, some are good, some are bad. And that's always weighed in relationship to their faithfulness, their fidelity to Yahweh and his laws. Another way the kings are compared, besides their faithfulness, is how they compare to David. How do they rise to his level or not? Some are compared favorably to David, but they in relationship to him, but nobody is ever identified as surpassing David. The best kings in Judah are Hezekiah and Josiah. So, what have we discovered? That in the Deuteronomistic history, it's telling of the story of the time before the exile to try to explain how the exile happened, because actually that line of kings takes you to the exilic moment, the final kings who are defeated by Babylon. The focus is upon the centralization of worship in Jerusalem and this blessing curse, or what I always call this two-way theology, the red road or the black road. That this is the theological emphases of the whole Deuteronomistic history, but it's established there initially in the book of Deuteronomy itself. And then we move into Joshua in this telling of the story, which talks about the sort of ritualized conquest of the land, and that leads to conquest with a covenant renewal ceremony at the end of the book of Joshua there in chapter 24. And of course, what that's trying to emphasize is that if we get back to the land of Israel, it's not through military might that this is going to happen, but rather through fidelity to the laws of God, and by being faithful to the covenant. And we can imagine once we are brought by Yahweh back to the land, that the covenant can be restored. We saw in Judges this fourfold cycle pattern that again would be indicating to the people of Israel, or Judah rather, there in Babylon, that this experience of falling away from God is not new. It's maybe more dramatic, but it's been a long process, ongoing process, and we simply have to return back to God to restore our relationship with Him. And then we saw that there's an ambiguous relationship to the monarchy, but Saul's portrayed as sort of a tragic figure, and that finally even the kings got worse and worse over time generally. A couple good kings there in Judah, but on the whole, a sense that part of the problem might have been that monarchy in the telling of the story here, the lack of the fidelity of the kings. So with that, we'll pause, we'll stop, and we look forward to talking more about the story of David in our class.